The green glow of my dual monitors was the only light in my home office just outside Houston, Texas, casting long, eerie shadows across the dark wood walls. It was exactly 1:05 in the morning on a cold, rainy Tuesday when the personal phone on my desk began to buzz. In the pipeline infrastructure industry, a call at that hour never brought good news. It usually meant a sudden pressure blowout, a hazardous environmental spill, or a crew emergency in the middle of a swamp. For 15 years as the senior project director for Apex Construction Group, I had been the one who answered those midnight calls, ready to coordinate emergency responses. But the name flashing on the screen this time was not one of my site supervisors or safety directors. It was Sean Thornton, the chief executive officer of Apex. I picked up the receiver, a cold knot of apprehension forming in my stomach, and asked if everything was all right at the Odessa site. Sean did not offer a greeting or ask how I was doing. His voice was clipped, carrying the clinical, rehearsed detachment of a man reading a script prepared by an expensive legal team. He told me that he needed to inform me of an immediate organizational restructuring that would affect my position. He explained that my role as senior project director was being eliminated, effective immediately. He said the board of directors had decided to consolidate all project oversight under a new vice president of strategic development, which would bring a more streamlined approach to infrastructure management. I sat in silence for a moment, watching the real-time telemetry feeds on my screens. From my home office, I was actively monitoring 3 major pipeline construction projects across Texas and Oklahoma. Together, these 3 active sites represented $1.2 billion in contracts for massive energy clients like Chevron and ExxonMobil. I was 54 years old. I had spent 10 years with the Army Corps of Engineers building bridges under heavy fire in hostile territories, and the last 15 years turning Apex from a struggling local contractor into the most reliable infrastructure builder in the region. I had planned to work for another 5 years to build up our retirement fund and ensure that my wife Clara's medical bills from her recent heart surgery did not eat into our savings. To be told that my expertise was expendable in a phone call lasting less than 4 minutes was a bitter pill to swallow. I asked Sean what kind of restructuring required firing the director of active pipeline sites in the middle of the night. I pointed out that we had critical federal environmental inspections scheduled for the morning and that crews were currently running high-pressure hydrostatic tests. Sean dismissed my concerns with a wave of corporate jargon. He said the decision was finalized and had to be implemented immediately for administrative efficiency. I asked him who was taking over my duties. He named Peter Jenkins, a young manager whose background was in strategic corporate development, not pipeline engineering. I knew the name from corporate newsletters. He was a relative of a major board member, hired to look good in quarterly meetings, but possessing absolutely zero field experience. I asked if Peter had been briefed on the inspection schedules, or if he understood the delicate calibration needed for the high-pressure hydrostatic pumps. Sean assured me that Peter had been provided with comprehensive transition documentation and would coordinate with the site managers. I told Sean that you cannot run a $1.2 billion pipeline project with paperwork. It required years of building relationships with federal inspectors, understanding the mechanical quirks of the telemetry dashboards, and knowing which subcontractors would cut corners if they were not watched closely. Sean replied that they appreciated my years of dedication, but had full confidence in Peter's fresh perspective. He then instructed me to cease all project activities and transfer all digital access credentials to Peter by 2 in the morning. I looked at the monitors showing the flow diagnostics, the pressure sensors, and the environmental telemetry. At the heart of our operations was a proprietary software dashboard I had personally designed, coded, and patented under the name FlowGuard. It was a real-time calibration algorithm that allowed site supervisors to monitor pressure spikes and environmental compliance simultaneously. Under my licensing agreement with Apex, the software was licensed to the company on a non-exclusive basis, but with a strict clause. The license was tied directly to my active employment. The moment my employment was terminated, the software license ceased. and any continued use of FlowGuard would constitute a direct violation of federal patent law. I asked Sean if the legal department had reviewed the transition plan, specifically regarding the proprietary software and the licensing agreements. Sean laughed, a condescending sound through the line. He told me that they had plenty of proprietary systems and that HR would handle the administrative details in the morning. He told me to just transfer the passwords and let the new team do their job. I took a deep breath. I understood, I said. I told him I would transfer the digital credentials for the company's servers within the hour. Sean thanked me for being cooperative, said HR would call me tomorrow regarding my severance package, and hung up. The call lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I sat in the quiet room, the rain beating against the window pane. 15 years of working 70-hour weeks, missing family dinners, and saving the company from multi-million-dollar regulatory fines all ended in a midnight phone call because a board member wanted to install his nephew to streamline operations. I looked at my screens, knowing that a massive storm was brewing on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. At 47 minutes past 1 in the morning, I began the process of transferring the basic administrative credentials for the corporate databases and servers. I was careful to follow Sean's instructions to the letter, ensuring that I gave them no grounds to accuse me of withholding company property. I uploaded the access codes for the equipment registries, the contractor directories, and the general project files to the shared corporate server. But when it came to the proprietary FlowGuard telemetry software, I did not hand over the master encryption keys or the licensing tokens. The software was my personal intellectual property, developed on my own time and registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Under Title 35, Section 271 of the United States Code, I had the exclusive right to prevent others from using my patented invention. The licensing agreement signed by Apex's previous management was clear. The license terminated automatically upon the cessation of my employment. The moment the clock struck 2 in the morning, I logged into my personal master server, entered my private security key, and revoked the active licensing token for the FlowGuard system. The telemetry screens across the 3 pipeline sites in Odessa, Corpus Christi, and Tulsa immediately went dark, reverting to basic uncalibrated raw data feeds that were nearly impossible to interpret without my custom algorithms. I knew that without this real-time telemetry calibration, the site crews would be blind, unable to verify if the pressure spikes were within the safety parameters or if the environmental compliance limits were being breached. At exactly 23 minutes past 2 in the morning, my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the caller identification showed it was originating from the Apex corporate exchange. I answered, and a nervous, young voice introduced himself as Peter Jenkins, the new Vice President of Strategic Development. He sounded exhausted and panicked. He told me that he was trying to log into the project monitoring dashboard, but the screen was displaying an encryption error. He asked if I could provide him with the bypass codes or explain how to restart the telemetry feed. I told Peter that I had transferred all basic server credentials as instructed by the Chief Executive Officer. I explained that the real-time calibration dashboard was run on the FlowGuard software, which was my patented intellectual property. I told him that because my employment had been terminated at 5 past 1 in the morning, the license had expired and the software was no longer available for use by Apex. Peter stuttered, asking if I could just give him temporary access until the morning so he could get through the scheduled inspections. He said he had not expected to start managing the active projects tonight and had not reviewed the ongoing operations. He admitted that he was looking at the raw telemetry data and could not understand why the sensor readings were fluctuating so wildly on the Tulsa segment. I told him that I was no longer an employee of Apex and was legally barred from accessing their servers or providing operational guidance. I recommended that he contact Sean Thornton or the corporate legal department to resolve the licensing issue. He became defensive, asserting that the company owned all work product created during my tenure. I calmly explained that the patent was filed under my name years before I joined Apex and was licensed under a specific conditional contract. I wished him luck and ended the call. Within minutes, my phone began to vibrate continuously. Site supervisors from all three projects were calling my personal number, looking for guidance. Miguel Santos, the veteran site supervisor at the Odessa project, sent a text message stating that they were in the middle of a pressure test and the calibration screens had frozen. I did not reply. I turned my phone face down on the desk. I walked out of my office and into the kitchen, where I made a pot of black coffee. The noise woke my wife, Clara Vance. She walked into the kitchen in her robe, looking at me with concern. She asked if everything was all right at the pipeline sites. I poured her a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. I told her that Sean Thornton had called me at midnight and terminated my employment to streamline the company. Clara stared at me in disbelief, asking how they could fire the person who had built the company's safety record from 78% to 98% over 15 years. I told her that corporate executives often confuse cutting costs with cutting capabilities. Clara took my hand, reminding me of our early years in the military when we had to move every 2 years and how we had built a stable life here. She assured me that my reputation in the industry was pristine and that we would figure it out. I sat there, mentally calculating our savings, realizing that we had enough to cover Clara's remaining medical bills and live comfortably while I planned my next move. I smiled, feeling a sense of relief. For 15 years, I had carried the weight of those 3 pipelines on my shoulders, constantly worrying about pressure spikes, environmental compliance, and worker safety. Now, the responsibility belonged to someone else. I looked out the window as the first light of dawn began to break over the trees, wondering how long the house of cards would stand before it fell. At 8 o'clock in the morning, my personal attorney, Clint Adler, sent a formal, notarized cease and desist letter to the corporate headquarters of Apex Construction Group. The letter was addressed directly to Sean Thornton and the legal department. Clint was a brilliant contract specialist who did not mince words. He had reviewed the licensing contract at 7 in the morning and confirmed that Sean's restructuring had bypassed corporate counsel, leaving the board completely exposed. Clint Adler had been my trusted counselor for over a decade, representing me in patent filings and contract reviews. When I called him at 7 in the morning, he was already at his desk, drinking black coffee. He listened to my explanation of the midnight call and laughed, noting that Sean Thornton had made a rookie mistake by executing a restructuring without consulting corporate counsel first, leaving the board of directors completely blindsided by the legal dependencies. He immediately drafted the notarized cease and desist letter, making sure to highlight the statutory penalties under federal patent law. The letter was delivered by courier to the Apex corporate headquarters at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The notice stated that Apex was no longer authorized to execute the FlowGuard software or access its proprietary calibration database. It explicitly cited Title 35, Section 271 of the United States Code, warning that any continued use of the system would constitute willful patent infringement. Clint noted that under federal patent law, specifically Title 35, Section 284, willful infringement carried treble damages, which could easily exceed several $1,000,000 for a project of this scale. Clint explained in the letter that the software was my personal property, registered under patent number 8,421,093, and that Apex had no right to run the telemetry parsing scripts that prevented database errors. Furthermore, the letter pointed out that the abrupt termination of the senior project director during hazardous operations violated the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as the WARN Act, under Title 29, Section 2101, which required 60 days written notice for significant employment restructurings that impacted operational safety. The reaction from Apex was immediate panic. The corporate legal department realized that using my software without a license exposed the company to massive federal lawsuits and treble damages. They ordered Peter Jenkins to disable all instances of the FlowGuard telemetry platform immediately to avoid liability. Unfortunately for Peter, the 3 pipeline sites could not function safely without it. At 9:47 in the morning, the Environmental Protection Agency inspector, Agent Brody, arrived at the Odessa site for a scheduled review of the new pipeline section. Agent Brody was known as a strict regulatory officer who checked every detail. The inspector demanded to see the certified environmental pressure logs for the previous 24 hours. Under federal regulations, these logs had to be calibrated to show that no methane leaks had occurred. Without the FlowGuard dashboard, Site Supervisor Miguel Santos had only raw, uncalibrated sensor data that Agent Brody refused to accept. Miguel tried to explain that the new vice president had disabled the calibration dashboard, but Agent Brody replied that he did not care about corporate drama, only strict environmental compliance. He told Miguel that raw data could hide significant leaks, and that without the calibrated reports, he had no choice but to shut them down. He warned Miguel that conducting high-pressure testing with uncalibrated telemetry was a direct violation of the Federal Pipeline Safety Act, and that if the site did not cease operations immediately, he would refer the company to the Department of Justice for criminal negligence. With daily fines of $50,000 looming, Miguel had no choice but to order the crew to shut down the drills and lock the site. Miguel texted me to report that the Odessa project was frozen and that the company was facing daily fines of $50,000. Meanwhile, my phone was ringing off the hook. At 7:45 in the morning, Sean Thornton called my personal number. His tone was completely different from the cold, clinical voice he had used the night before. He told me that there had been some minor operational misunderstandings at the Odessa site, and asked if I could come into the office for a consultation. He said the company was prepared to pay me an emergency consulting fee of $5,000 a day to help Peter get oriented. I told Sean that I was no longer available. I explained that when he fired me for administrative efficiency, he eliminated my operational clearance. I told him that my rate was no longer cheap, and that I was currently exploring other opportunities. Sean raised his voice, claiming that I was sabotaging the company by withholding the software. I reminded him that the cease and desist letter was a standard legal protection for intellectual property that Apex did not own. I advised him to let his new vice president of strategic development handle the operational challenges with his fresh perspective. I hung up the phone before he could reply. Within the hour, the news of my sudden availability had spread through the industry. The pipeline construction business in Texas is a small, tightly knit world, and word travels faster than a summer storm. By 10 in the morning, I had received messages from 3 of Apex's regional competitors. The most intriguing call came from Grant Bowman, the chief executive officer of Pinnacle Infrastructure Systems, Apex's largest rival. Grant asked if we could meet for lunch in Dallas to discuss a partnership. I told him I would be delighted. I drove up the highway, watching the open Texas landscape, knowing that the empire Sean Thornton thought he could streamline was beginning to crumble from its foundation. By 2:15 in the afternoon, the operational failures at Apex had escalated into a full-scale emergency. At the Corpus Christi site, the main pump station began throwing critical thermal error codes. The site was running high-pressure hydrostatic tests on a critical segment of the pipeline, holding water at 900 pounds per square inch to test the integrity of the steel welds. The sensors were registering 92 degrees Celsius, well above the safe operating limit of 80 degrees Celsius for high-pressure testing. Gavin Miller, the senior equipment specialist at the site, called my personal phone in a panic. He explained that Peter Jenkins had ordered him to manually bypass the safety overrides and restart the Model 47 pumps to keep the project on schedule. Gavin knew, as I did, that the Model 47 pumps were highly sensitive. If they were restarted while throwing thermal error codes without the proper calibration sequence, they could suffer a catastrophic mechanical failure, potentially causing a high-pressure blowout that would destroy a $250,000 pump station and endanger the lives of the crew. Gavin told me that he had asked Peter for the override code, but Peter had no idea how the system worked. Gavin had argued with Peter, explaining the danger of vapor lock and thermal explosion, but Peter had shouted at him, demanding immediate compliance and calling his concerns irrelevant. The physical environment at the Corpus Christi site was tense, with the summer humidity hanging thick in the air and mosquitoes buzzing around the floodlights of the main pump station. Gavin Miller, standing near the massive manifold, felt the vibration in the concrete slab beneath his steel-toed boots. He knew that water under 900 pounds per square inch of pressure carried kinetic energy equivalent to an explosive device, and any failure of the weld would release a lethal jet of water that could slice through metal. Peter Jenkins, calling from a quiet boardroom in Houston, could not comprehend these physical realities. To Peter, the project was just rows and columns on a spreadsheet, and the warning codes were merely software alerts that could be cleared with a restart command. When Gavin tried to explain that the pump was overheating because of a friction lock, Peter cut him off, telling him that safety parameters had a built-in tolerance, and that his job was to get the line running before Chevron's executives noticed the delay. This arrogance was the final straw for Gavin. He looked at his crew members, men with families who trusted him to keep them safe, and decided he was not going to risk their lives. Gavin, a veteran of 20 years of heavy equipment operation, was so outraged by Peter's incompetence and disregard for safety protocols that he refused to touch the controls. He remembered the time a pump had exploded at another firm, injuring several workers, and he was not going to let that happen here. He told Peter that he would not risk his life or face criminal safety charges for a manager who had never stood in the mud. Fearing a catastrophic blowout, Gavin and his entire maintenance team refused to execute the manual bypass. They shut down the main pump station, bringing all operations at the Corpus Christi site to a complete standstill. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the Tulsa site collapsed. A sudden weather delay had disrupted the concrete pouring schedule for the pipeline supports. The logistics coordinator, Paul Higgins, tried to contact Peter Jenkins for a crew rescheduling plan. Peter, in an attempt to cut costs, unilaterally rescheduled the subcontractor, Howard Construction, without checking the contracts of the other active crews. When the owner, Roy Howard, a veteran contractor who had worked with me for 12 years, arrived at the site, he found 3 different crews assigned to the same workspace, resulting in complete gridlock. Peter reportedly treated Roy with corporate arrogance, telling him that he had to comply with the new schedule or face contract penalties. Roy Howard, a Navy veteran who had served as a mechanic, had built a reputation for absolute reliability and did not tolerate corporate posturing from young managers. He immediately ordered all of his crews to pack up their equipment and walk off the job. He told Peter that Howard Construction had survived 3 economic recessions, and that they did not take orders from people who did not know how to run a project. He threatened to sue Apex for breach of contract and immediately pulled all of his heavy machinery from the site. By 6 in the evening, all 3 major pipeline projects, representing $1.2 billion in contracts, were operating at less than 30% capacity. At 47 minutes past 6 in the evening, my former assistant, Olivia Flores, called me in tears. She told me that the corporate office in Houston was in absolute chaos. Sean Thornton had been in emergency meetings with the board of directors all afternoon. Chevron and ExxonMobil had both sent formal inquiries regarding the operational delays. Under the terms of the contracts I had negotiated, Apex was facing late penalties of $200,000 per day for each site that remained inactive. Olivia said that Peter Jenkins was hiding in his office, unable to answer the technical questions from the clients. She asked if there was anything I could do to help. I told Olivia that the situation was out of my hands. I told her that the executives had wanted a streamlined company, and now they had to live with the results of their efficiency. I advised her to update her resume, as the fallout from this disaster would be long-lasting. I hung up the phone and walked out to the porch, where Clara was waiting for me. We sat in the quiet evening, watching a hawk fly over the pasture, while the storm of Apex's own making raged miles away. On Friday morning, exactly 3 weeks after my termination, I walked into the corporate headquarters of Pinnacle Infrastructure Systems in Dallas to meet with Grant Bowman. The lunch meeting we had held earlier had evolved into a formal job offer. The office was impressive, with a glass boardroom overlooking the Dallas skyline, and the atmosphere was one of professional respect. Grant introduced me to the board of directors, who welcomed me warmly, explaining that they had tried to win the regional pipeline contracts for years, but had always been blocked by my flawless safety record at Apex. Grant presented me with a contract to become the vice president of pipeline operations at Pinnacle, complete with a 10% equity stake in the company and a starting salary of $250,000 per year. I signed the contract that morning. My first act was to reach out to the talented professionals who had made Apex's operations work for 15 years. I called Miguel Santos, Gavin Miller, and Paul Higgins. Within 2 weeks, all three had resigned from Apex and joined me at Pinnacle, relieved to be working under a leadership team that valued safety and technical expertise. Roy Howard also moved his entire contracting firm, signing an exclusive partnership agreement with Pinnacle. When Miguel, Gavin, and Paul arrived at the Dallas office for their onboarding meeting, we gathered in the glass conference room. There was a palpable sense of relief in the room. These men had spent weeks dealing with Peter Jenkins's constant emergency calls and corporate posturing, and they were eager to return to a professional environment where their expertise was appreciated. We spent the first week reorganizing our logistics and preparing our bid for the Trans-Texas expansion. When Chevron and ExxonMobil withdrew their contracts from Apex, their operations managers called me directly. They admitted that they had only kept their business with Apex because of my safety management, and once they realized the company had fired the institutional knowledge, they had no confidence in their ability to deliver the project safely. Industry publications, including the Pipeline and Gas Journal and Construction Weekly, began running detailed articles about the severe operational disruptions at Apex. The reports cited the failed EPA inspection at Odessa, the pump station shutdown at Corpus Christi, and the massive contractor disputes in Tulsa. The articles quoted independent construction experts who stated that Apex's collapse was a classic case of corporate arrogance and loss of critical operational memory. The final blow came when Chevron and ExxonMobil formally terminated their contracts with Apex, citing material breach of performance and safety covenants. They reassigned the projects to Pinnacle, including the prestigious $400 million Trans-Texas pipeline expansion that I had spent 3 years developing for Apex before I was fired. 9 months after my termination, my personal phone rang. It was Sean Thornton. His voice was subdued, stripped of all the corporate arrogance he had displayed during our midnight call. He told me that the board of directors had demoted him and that Peter Jenkins had been fired and blacklisted from the pipeline industry. Sean explained that the board had sued him for breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law, for failing to check the software licensing agreements before terminating my employment, and that the company was facing financial ruin. He asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss lessons learned, and if there was any possibility of Pinnacle acquiring some of Apex's remaining assets. I told Sean that I did not think a meeting would be productive. I told him that he had made a fundamental mistake. He had confused having operations with understanding them. I explained that some lessons are simply too expensive to teach twice, and then I hung up the phone. 2 years later, Apex Construction Group was sold to a national firm for 60% below its peak valuation. The industry analysts specifically cited the loss of institutional knowledge and the immediate collapse of their pipeline operations as the turning points that destroyed the company's value. Meanwhile, Pinnacle Infrastructure Systems had become the dominant player in the region, generating $800 million in annual revenue. One evening, Clara and I were sitting on our back porch, watching the sunset over the pasture. My retirement account was larger than it had ever been, and I was working with a leadership team that respected my expertise. Our safety record had reached 99%, and Pinnacle's market valuation had doubled since I joined. Clara laughed, pointing out that Sean Thornton had fired me to save a few $1,000s in salary, only to hand their biggest competitor hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. I smiled, raising my coffee cup to the setting sun. I told her that it was not about revenge. It was just about business. You can fire a manager, but you can never fire what he knows, and you certainly cannot fire the relationships he has built over 15 years of doing the job the right way. If a company does not value the expertise that keeps their pipelines flowing, they will eventually learn that someone else will. That is the ultimate law of the field, and it is a law that no corporate restructuring can ever streamline away. This experience taught me that in our industry, safety and respect are not just values you write on a poster. They are the actual mechanisms that keep the operations running successfully.